This podcast is brought to you by our supporters on patreon.com and coffee.com. Our supporters are the backbone of the podcast, and we are very thankful for all of you. Your contributions allow us to seek the best ideas and disruptors in the world and bring you podcasts that energize, transform, and change your community. We hope you take courage and join our one-time contributors through coffee.com or our monthly ones on patreon.com. You'll get amazing merch and early access to our unedited interviews and produced podcasts. If you want to contribute, hit the links in the description below. And thank you. I was 11 when I realized what abortion was. I had learned what it was before, but it never left an impression in my mind until that year. I was attending a Catholic school, and near the bookstore there were 3 signs that stated, "What would you do?" The signs gave hypothetical examples of mothers who were in difficult circumstances: poverty, life and death, and sexual abuse. After the hypothetical examples, there was a sign that said, one of this was real. An abortion would have cost us a pope. Pope John Paul II had just died the year before, and Joseph Ratzinger, otherwise known as Benedict XVI, had been elected to continue with his duties. I remained shocked. Even as an Adventist, I thought about the Pope's influence and what a great disaster had been averted. A man with such influence, I thought, could have not been born. And who knows how much of a difference that would have made in the history of the world. Pope John Paul II had a lot of influence, and he was a great pope. I imagine some of you are going to go and share this clip with the compliance committees in order to get the podcast label as a pro-pope one. But that's not today's topic. We're not talking about the Pope. We're talking about abortion. As I ponder on John Paul's second life as an 11-year-old, I reflected on the achievements and major shifts that the Pope had helped accomplish during the 20th century. The fight against communism, the bringing down of dictatorships, the appeasing of the scandals from his church. But after considering all of those things, I never considered the other side. The story of the woman carrying that baby, what she went through, the decision-making that she had to do. Until...
Well, for one, I had gotten pregnant unwantedly. I was in the seminary. And when I say unwanted, I mean so as to say that I said no, I said stop, I said, this isn't going to work for me. And I was a victim of rape. And so to me, sex was something very personal, and I did not want to have it with this person. But they used the whole line of, well, this is how I express my love, and if you love me, and him being a pastor and I being a pastor in training, it was tough. It was a tough time, a very tough time. And there was a lot, there was a lot to lose. There was a lot to lose and a lot in jeopardy at the time. And my health just wasn't there either at the time.
When it comes to the abortion debate within society or our church, I often hear the arguments from pro-life and pro-choice individuals. Some supporting life arguments come from the Bible, affirming the humanity of the unborn child. The supporting choice arguments also come from the Bible, as they quote the scriptures as a basis to not suppress anyone's choice. But as I listen to the arguments, they do not provide me with the story of someone who actually went through it. What was on their mind? There's always something lacking in these debates. And that's the power of a story. What was someone going through? So let's continue listening.
I wasn't sure what to do. And I didn't realize it then. I realize it now. Sometimes we put people in our lives in difficult positions to make choices that we're too coward to make. And I didn't want to get rid of the child, though it was an unwanted pregnancy, and in an unwanted relationship. And I went to my ethics professor in the seminary. And I asked him, I said, this is the situation. And I told him everything. I was honest. I told him where I was health-wise. My body was not in a place that I should be pregnant. And I was still recuperating from the abuse that I had experienced. And so I explained all of this to him. And he looked at me and he said, sometimes the decisions that we make are not necessarily good or bad decisions. He said, sometimes they're better, best decisions. And he said, this is not a good or bad decision. And of course, I had so many questions. Well, the Bible says don't kill and all these pragmatics. And I could, break down the fact that, yes, the child was not a child yet. There was no heartbeat yet. It was still a zygote, but, it's just the idea of bringing an end to someone's life that I am not responsible for. For, in the sense responsible, I lose that. Of course, I use that loosely because though I didn't want to have sex, I did, and it led to this pregnancy, and now I have this decision to make because of it. But my professor helped me see that it wasn't something that I wouldn't be the first, I wouldn't be the last. And he just gave it a very humanistic perspective on, it's okay and it's going to be okay. And so he probably was the most major decision when it came to my decision making. He was the biggest influence that I had. I called my mother as well, and she also was like, I don't want you to be tied to someone for the rest of your life that you will look at as a father of this child and have to deal with him when you harbor so much anger and hate towards him. It's not going to be healthy for you or the child either. So, and I asked other people and their opinions were kind of the same. And so those were my major influencers at that time.
Thanks for that. Something that I'm kind of curious is how long did it take you to make this difficult decision during this time?
As soon as I found out that I was pregnant, I went to the doctor and I immediately asked for a pamphlet to know what I can do with the pregnancy. And during that time, it was only a week of thinking and mulling it over because I knew that I didn't want it to get to a place where it did become a child from what I define as a baby.
Did you catch that last part? That's part of the debate. When can we call a child a child? When is a human a human? And to be honest, there's a lot of evidence for both sides. And we don't even know how the human consciousness works. And it's really hard to make a determination. But as we continue listening, I think that something that really opened my eyes to this conversation is that sometimes we put focus where, we shouldn't. And that's what really surprised me when I was talking with our guest today. That sometimes as males, especially myself, I miss certain sections, certain ideas that I never considered.
I think that the issue, honestly, is a couple of things. It's, first of all, the stigma of what losing a virginity does to a child. When I was growing up, I used to go to conferences where they used to take, this literally happened to me, okay? They took a white lifesaver and said, this is your virginity. And then she proceeded to chew it and spit it out and said, and this is what becomes of you when you give your virginity away to anyone but your husband. Yet in my case, I never had the opportunity to give my virginity away because I was raped. And so I already saw myself as a lesser than member of society. And because the church does this thing of stigmatizing women that are not meeting their expectations and what they believe that a woman should be, it creates this negative stigma of sex. And it's not a matter or a discussion of purity. It becomes a discussion of holiness. And that's the problem, because you really can't, I say this all the time. You cannot legislate morality. You cannot, because even God gives choice. And it's so easy for us to sit there and judge people who have abortions and judge people that have sex before marriage and judge people. You get judged if you have the abortion. You get judged if you have the baby out of wedlock. You get judged if you have sex outside of marriage. You get judged for everything that you do. But the class system of sin exists among humanity and not God, because he sees it the same. So the person who takes a life is as bad as the person who lies, is as bad as a person who steals, is as bad as a person who decides to do anything outside of God's will. And that's most of what everybody does. And so we like to act as if it's our job to control other people and their decisions, instead of what Christ exemplified in his example when the woman was caught in adultery and is brought to him, and he asks, well, where are those who accuse you? Because he wanted them to understand, not that he was judging them, but that they had no moral grounds to judge her. And I think that all too often, and far too often in our church, we tend to do exactly that. We want to be judge and jury, and we criminalize people for what they do. And if we could put them in a holy jail, if you would, we would. That's why there were years of censorship and years of removing membership from books and years of, even now, where women are still being discussed in rooms where they're not even welcome to be part of the conversation, because it's difficult for other people to see through the lens of someone else. It's easier to judge them, not to put yourself in their shoes.
And that is what we're hoping to do today. Putting ourselves in someone else's shoes, listening, not arguing, and just reflecting. After the break, we continue with our discussion of abortion on Disruptive Adventism. You have an idea. You want to tell it to the world, but you don't know where to start. That's where Anchor comes in. They have the tools for you to edit, produce, and record your idea right from your phone or computer. It's the easiest way to reach and grow your audience. They publish for you to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major platforms. And to top it all off, they match you with advertisers so you can earn from your passion and your wonderful idea. So tell me, what are you waiting for? Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started and follow your dream. Today on Disruptive Adventism, we're talking about abortion, and we're going to continue the story of our guest and what she has to share about politicians, pastors, and how to put ourselves in someone else's shoes.
So it's not that anti-choice people are trying to stop abortion, right? I think that they're just trying to legislate who can and can't have an abortion. Because the reality is, if any of these men's daughters have unwanted pregnancies, you better believe, Pastor, that they're going to find a place where their daughters can, quote unquote, take care of it, right? What they're doing is literally, and I think Rachel Britt said this. She said this to Trevor Noah. She said something along the lines of, like, if you criminalize abortion, you're just keeping people trapped in poverty. And that's what they want. It's not that they're spending their money to have sexual education or to talk about giving women better options to birth control or to create better birth control or to give free contraceptives or to even, remove the stigma of almost to say that women are always to blame. But men just, they do whatever they want. They walk away unscathed, and not all men. I know some men who've had women that have terminated pregnancy and it has affected them. I do know men like that. But I also know that a lot of men feel like they're not to blame, that the woman should have taken better care of herself or that she shouldn't have done X, Y, Z. But I have to remind them that before a woman is pregnant, the man is pregnant. So, I know it sounds weird, but it's true, and women can't do this by themselves. And so the idea that the the harshness comes down on these women is pretty ridiculous. And for pastors, and I talk to pastors all the time, especially my black brothers. I have to remind them that it is extremely important for you to remember that as segregated as our conferences still very much are, how much more segregated must conferences within our own conferences? Women pastors are marginalized. In regional conferences, there are about one or two, maybe three, maybe four women. I know a conference that has one woman pastor. I know some that still don't have any. But the fact that they're allowed into the seminary and they study with the men, they take their money, so their money is good, but their theology isn't. And so the idea that you would put somebody in that position where you would say, well, you're only as good as I allow you to be, that's a problem. It's a problem. And, even I'm a Latina, and I understand that a lot of times I'm marginalized because I'm Hispanic. And that's a problem. And I think that there's just so much marginalization in the church. There are so many categories that you can be pushed into. And it's terrible. And so now I feel like abortion is just one more category for people to have over other people's heads to, once again, create legislative laws that work against minorities, against immigrants, against people that are not the white people that are sitting in office doing this, making these laws.
I know some of you listening may disagree with some of the things that our guest has said, but you're listening to this podcast for a reason, to disrupt a little bit of your life and to, understand a little bit better what other people are going through. I certainly had to do that as I was listening to the story. After talking with our guest for a couple of minutes and a couple of other questions that came by, I asked her what is the lesson that she's learned since then and how that has shaped her life in a positive or negative manner.
Other than the fact that I'm not the only one, because that's something that haunted me for a bit. There's a lot of stigma against women who take these kinds of decisions, regardless of the reasons why they do it, But I did get married, and I lost my first child. And to be candid and honest with you, I blamed myself. And I told my husband that it was my fault because I had made a decision and this was my punishment for my decision. But I had such an amazing husband, and he was apt and quick to tell me, no, it's not your fault. This happens. And we had a proper burial for the aborted child. I went to therapy, and my therapist also helped a lot. And I am so much of a stronger person today because of that, because I didn't allow a decision that I made to define the rest of my life. And unfortunately, in Adventism, we tend to label ourselves as our mistakes, and we permanently affix labels that are only temporary seasons. And that's what keeps us hostage. And then we excuse bad behavior, or we tell ourselves that we'll never be better than what we are, and we limit what God can do because we don't believe that God is a restorative God who gives the things that sin takes away, and who does not call you by your sin, but calls you by, child, you're mine, and I love you, and my grace covers the multitude of iniquities, all of them. And so I've had to live in that truth and embrace the fact that I am forgiven, and God has restored me, and God has given me things that I could never imagine that I would ever receive. And He is a good God and a faithful one. And that's where I live now. That's my reality now.
To be honest, that's a great lesson. To learn how to live a life of hope, even amidst our mistakes, our decisions, if you will. One last thing that I discussed with our guest was, what can the church do? You've been listening and you're probably wondering, well, how can we interact more with people that need us today? With people that may be considering abortion? With people that may be vulnerable and that we need to protect? How do we do that? How do we change? How do we live in grace?
Well, first is understanding that we don't get to decide how other people live their lives. Even as a pastor, it's hard for you not to want to see what's best. Your kids do things exactly as you want them to do it, right? It's hard for you to see people that are living lives that you don't necessarily agree with. But I always remind people that God did not call us to be sous chefs or to be chefs of any kind. He called us to just go fish. And going fishing means I'm going to create a safe place where my fish will feel comfortable enough to come and get hooked to whatever it is, whatever bait I'm trying to put out there. And I guarantee you that judgmental conversations and negative talk and fire and brimstone messages do not penetrate the heart. Scaring people into belief does not work. We have to foster a community of positivity, a community of unselfishness, of understanding that no one is perfect, and regardless of how heinous a sin is, that God can forgive, and that God can restore, and that God can give grace, and where there are holes, God can fill them. But he's trying to use us as vessels, as a church, where there is a hopeless society of people that are committing things that are so terrible because they feel like they have nowhere else to go. And so our job is not to judge the sinner. Our job is to say, okay, you made a mistake or you made a decision that was not the best, but let me introduce you to someone who loves you in spite of and saves you in spite of, because you're a sinner and you need his grace and you need his love, and not create huge boundaries and walls to keep different sins out. I stated yesterday to a friend of mine, it's not necessarily a separation of church and state. It's really a separation of your church from my state. And that's how we do it in the church. We do a separation of your sin from my sin. And if your sin is more obvious or more out there or more, or whatever I deem it to be, then it's just something too far. We have to get out of that mentality, because that's what we're called to do as Christians, not even as pastors, as Christians. We're called to set a tone so that people can feel welcome and loved. And yes, God will correct them. God will fix whatever it is that these people need to have fixed, but that's not our job. My job is to love on you and to care for you and to cover you. And I know some people will say, well, that's just so emotional and but that's the reality of who God is. When the Bible says, it defines all the things that love is. Love is patient and kind, and it doesn't hold resentment, and it's forgiving, and it's all these things. It's not defining an actual action. It's defining God. And so if this is who God is, then that's who I need to give to people. Not my biases, not my opinions, not my judgments, definitely not my critiques. We need to treat people like we want to be treated, If it was our child that had to make a decision like that or made a decision like that, how would you treat that child? How would you treat your sister or your mom if you found out that she had one? And so that's kind of the mentality that we need to have moving forward in this conversation. It's not so much, how do I punish you? How do I chastise you? Or how do I make you know that what you did was wrong? Because believe you me, a lot of us know that we probably could have handled it better, but we made the decisions that we made. And so we deal with the consequences that come. But what we don't need is more badgering. What we don't need is more neglect. What we don't need is more disrespect. What we don't need is more negative self-talk. Trust me, if anybody is a harsh critic, it's me on myself. Well, we need to be more loving and more patient. In life, we are always going to face tough decisions, and sometimes we're not going to make the right ones. But just because we don't make the right ones, it doesn't mean that we can't get back up and try again. And I hope that people can see that I think that your podcast is exactly that. It's disrupting the way that we've been taught to think, and it's pushing Adventism to be better, because we can be better. We can do better. So I hope that's the message that is received today.
You've been listening to Disruptive Adventism. We hope that today's topic helped you to think and change something about your practices, about your faith, about your Adventism. If you want to subscribe, make sure to go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcast. We'll be there. And make sure to give us a review if you like what you're listening to. If you want to support, make sure to go to patreon.com/disruptiveadventism. It helps us pay our bills and produce the content that you're listening to. And if you want to socialize, make sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram or on Twitter, and hit us up whenever you need anything. We'll be there to support you. Thank you for listening today. We hope you join us next time. And as always, we invite you to be disruptive.